This week's episode of the TribCast is sponsored by Water Grows. All right, hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for January 28th, 2025. I am Matthew Watkins, editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune. We are joined, as usual, by Eleanor Klibanoff, whose campaign continues to change the name of the TribCast to the Clibcast.
I wouldn't say it's my campaign. I would say it's the people's campaign. You know, it's a one-party, one-platform issue.
All right, well, and one supporter, too.
And one supporter.
And we have James Barragon, whose weekend was just ruined by the announcement of the State of the State speech on Sunday.
Oh, not ruined. I'm fine.
All right. Well, I mean, if you like to work on your weekends, that's
look on the positive side.
that's
still
good for you.
A day and a half to enjoy.
All right. So today we will be endeavoring to convince James to get excited about water policy. But before that, we're going to talk a little bit about what's happened in the news this week. We have, talked in previous episodes about, obviously Dustin Burrows' election to speaker, but also the campaign against him, one of which was around, the effort to get rid of Democratic committee chairs in the Texas House. It appears as though the hardline conservatives pushing for that may have lost the speaker's race, but at least won on this issue that they've been pursuing for multiple legislative sessions. James, tell us a little bit about what happened with the rules recently.
Well, yeah, it's surprising that you put it that way, because I think if you ask them, they would not see themselves as big winners. In fact, they said that Democrats have more power, which I think realistically and objectively, that is not true. In the rules, it says that the majority party will hold committee chairmanships, and the minority party will have vice chairmanships. So that effectively strips Democrats from being allowed to run committees, which is exactly what they wanted. Now, I think we have to be intellectually honest about this, that it's one of the things that they wanted. It's the big thing that they rallied around. But there are a bunch of other things that those hardline conservatives wanted that they did not get, which is what they are sort of yelling about and what they're making a big fuss about. Democrats and Speaker Burrows' Republican coalition are saying, hey, we gave you guys exactly what you wanted. The Democrat chairs are gone. And the hardline conservatives are saying, well, that's just one thing. And I've just pulled up the contract with Texas, which is what they basically are saying that they are following.
The contract with Texas is what the kind of more...
It's like the pledge that they came up with for
the conservatives came up with.
Yeah, which Cook had signed and said, Cook being David Cook of Mansfield, the other candidate for speaker who lost, obviously. But, just going down the list here, you only solicit support for speakership from Republican members. Obviously, neither of them did that. And the practice of awarding Democrats with committee chairmanship. That's high. That's number 2. And Burrows has done that. Ensure all GOP legislative priorities receive a floor vote before any Democrat bills. That has not been codified in the rules. Replace the current liberal, these are their words, liberal parliamentarians with staff committed to only offering advice on adherence to House rules, not advancing their personal ideology. They're referring to Hugh Brady, a Democrat, who was a parliamentarian, and he is gone now. There is only one parliamentarian.
What is the parliamentarian for people who don't know?
Parliamentarian basically interprets the rules and makes sure that the whatever body it is running according to the rules. And so there's a whole list of these, but you can see that there is differences here, right? The next one that I see is limiting the speaker to 2 terms to reduce their power over individual members. That also is not in the rules. And so what the hardliners wanted to do this week and last week in the rules is to put these things in, to codify them, to say you were going to commit to the entire contract with Texas. The thing is that Burrows never committed to those things. And so they can say, but this is the contract that we had committed to. Burrows never committed to. So there's truth in both spaces. But I think overall to your initial question is what are we going to see? I think we have to be, again, intellectually honest and say there's going to be a more conservative session no matter which way you slice it.
Well, James, I mean, we're sort of a broken record on this, but you have continuously made the point on this podcast that this is less about ideology and more about power, right? And, I think we have to ask the question, is this situation where if I wonder if Burroughs is asking this question too. Like, if he gives this group what they want on one thing, are they just going to start then saying, I want this instead, and if the point is to be kind of going after this speaker, and they seem kind of committed to doing that throughout this legislative session, is 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 this a sort of impossible battle to win in terms of getting the support and getting people to say, be happy with his speakership this session?
Right. I am not in Burroughs' head, so I wouldn't know. But what we've seen with previous speakers is they said Joe Strauss is too liberal, and he only gives us a little bit of red meat so that some members can go back to their districts and say they passed conservative legislation, and then the rest of us get shut out. So then Strauss steps down, Bonin comes in. He's clearly a more conservative speaker. He goes further to the right, and then they say this guy's not conservative enough. Then he goes down. Phelan comes in. He's more conservative, passes more conservative legislation, and they say he is not conservative enough. Then Burroughs comes in, and they're saying he's not conservative enough. Each of these guys has gone consistently more and more conservative, and it's just never enough for the hard right. That is their prerogative, and that is what they say their voters come to represent. But they will keep fighting that fight until the cows come home, I think.
Well, it's also interesting, as you have listed this kind of progression of more conservative speakers, that faction that's been unhappy with that leadership in the hard right has grown during that time as well, so kind of an interesting dynamic there.
Well, it's gone through waves, hasn't it? Like the Freedom Caucus was, they certainly were very active in 2017, and then they kind of waned, I think, thanks to Speaker Bonin, who really managed the chamber and the interchamber relationships well. And then they've popped back up. I don't know. I think it's come and gone, but certainly this year there are more people, more lawmakers aligned with that view.
Okay.
And that's for multiple reasons.
Quickly before we move on, what impact on governing does not having Democratic chairs have this legislative session, if any?
I think the conservatives are right. Democrats leading committees obviously helps Democrats. You think about things, and I've come up with a few examples. You think about in 2021, Harold Dutton leading public education. In the 2021 second special session, he refused to advance legislation that restricted transgender student athletes. And there was a lot of pressure coming from the lieutenant governor to pass that. That was SB 2 in that special session, clearly a priority bill. That bill got killed in 2021. You think about Chairman Pancho Nevarez in 2019 saying there wouldn't be a hearing on open carry legislation because some gun rights activists had gone and bothered lawmakers at their homes, which is pretty reprehensible. But Pancho says no more of that, and it's done. Obviously, that legislation later passed, but it was blocked. You think of people like Mrs. T, Symphonia Thompson of Houston in 2019 leading public education. Public health. And so then the abortion legislation stops going to public health and starts going to state affairs. I mean, there clearly is a stopper, and this is the way representative government works, right? So I think there will be an impact. I think to ignore these concerns that the conservatives are saying is to not be honest about this. But it's also fair to say that this is representative government, and just because they're the minority government doesn't mean that they should be completely shut out, which is, I think, what Burroughs is trying to get out with these vice chairs and these subcommittees, which we'll have to wait and see what impact they actually have. But the conservatives are obviously concerned about that because they think that's a run around the no chairs for Democrats.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, when you're a committee chair, every bill has to go through a committee in the House before it reaches the full floor. When you're a committee chair, you can control what comes up for a hearing. A lot of bills get rewritten in committee, so there is a considerable amount of power there for sure. All right, I want to talk next about both chambers filing their baseline budgets for the legislative session.
This is Matthew's favorite day of the year.
I do, again, the budget, the most important bill of the session every year, even though it maybe doesn't cause as much excitement as a lot of the other ones. Eleanor, what were the highlights that you saw?
Well, I will say just a brief anecdote to get inside the mind of Matthew Watkins. 2 years ago, when we were at this point, I remember our former colleague Karen Brooks Harper came to me and was like, Matthew has asked me to cover the budget. And I was like, it's like when a cat brings you a mouse as a present. And you're like, thank you. I don't want that. But I know it came with love. Yeah. You love the budget. Karen actually does love the budget. Also a nerd. I would say, the budget is the only thing the Texas legislature has to pass. They could pass that. They could go home. It's an idea. I think they should consider it. But assuming they're not going to do that, I mean, the budget has like all the high priority items. I think a lot of it was not a huge surprise. They are, as House Speaker Burrows said, substantially identical between the House and the Senate. Obviously, the working out the details is what, will take up most of the session. I think the big thing we were seeing is, a big increase in funding for vouchers. This has obviously been a conservative priority for a long time. Seems like they've got the votes this session, and this increase in funding definitely makes it seem like, they don't want to take a half step into vouchers. They want to run into that pretty significantly. And then also, as sort of promised, funding increases for public education to go into that, increases for teachers, rural teachers, which we should say the teacher groups feel like is still not enough. So figuring out how to balance those two things. The one thing I will say in my universe, in the health world, that's like a very big deal, a very small line item comparably to some of these big numbers. But the Texas Health and Human Services Commission has asked for $300 million to improve their Medicaid enrollment system, which is in the health world a huge deal. We've written a decent amount about that. And so that made it into both budgets. And I think people are pretty optimistic that that's gonna happen.
Yeah, I think two things you look for in those base budgets, which can very much change and will change over the coming months, are where is there agreement, right? Where do they have similar amounts of money? Where are there differences, and how does that change compared to previous years? So we saw both chambers $2.5 billion to spend on broadband expansion in the state, $2.5 billion to spend on water infrastructure. We'll talk more about that later. $5 billion on the grid, $3.5 billion to go toward property taxes, and as you mentioned, $1 billion for school vouchers, which is double what was in the budget last session, $500 million. We also saw a voucher bill get filed in the Senate that kind of laid out at least the Senate's proposal for what that would be. Again, we're talking about spending double the amount of money. The proposal being $10,000 to give, basically parents who want to send their kids to private school, maybe around $2,000 for parents who are going to homeschool their kids, things like that. They would prioritize low-income children and kids with disabilities in that range. When you talk about $10,000 per student, you're talking about funding for around 100,000 students in that realm. Worth noting, there's an estimated 290,000 private school students in Texas right now. So even though it is a significant increase in what they wanted to spend last year, it's still not enough to cover the students who are already in Texas public schools. So I think one question that will come up, if that is indeed how much they end up spending, is will there then be immediate demand to spend more in upcoming sessions from there?
Yeah, I think that's definitely obviously through, as we've talked about in previous episodes, like strategic winning of certain seats, like these policies have the numbers. It seems like vouchers is going to happen this session. That doesn't mean that like the way the bill is written today is like everyone agrees, we all shake hands and we go home. Like there's a lot of this to sort out. And Texas legislators are not overly fond of spending money. So, the more expensive this starts to look, obviously it's still going to get the support, but there might be sort of more guardrails.
It's on the border, then they're very happy to spend.
That's true. Actually, there's a lot of things they want to spend money on. But
I think that the agreement on the $1 billion is huge too. I was just trying to look up here the tweet from the governor where he sort of tweeted out approvingly of the $1 billion budget, and he said something like, I can't find the tweet right now, but like, this is a great start. And I think the indication that the Senate and the House are both at $1 billion shows you that the governor is also involved in sort of the settling on that number. So I'm not sure that is actually going to change.
Yeah, how does this bode for? I mean, there is. I took notice about how much agreement there was on these big ticket items. How much does this bode for the ability of the speaker and the lieutenant governor to get along this legislative session?
Well,
go for it.
I found it interesting. Obviously, Lieutenant Governor Patrick was very critical, or perhaps not critical. Yeah, I mean, he was critical of Burrows. And he was clearly very supportive of Cook, saying that he was the House GOP caucus nominee, right? But in the aftermath of the election, I've sort of seen like him leaving the door open and saying like Burrows will have the opportunity to prove that he's going to be the most conservative speaker. And Burrows, I think, compared to Phelan, is like a player, and he is like he knows the chamber, he knows the intra-chamber relationships. He's been involved in a lot of these negotiations. I think he's going to be a lot more forceful and perhaps tactful in how he deals both handling inter-chamber battles and intra-chamber battles. So I'm kind of curious to see how that plays out. The lieutenant governor has kind of backed off a little bit, I think.
Yeah, and also, I mean, last session, obviously, there was great discord between perhaps the big three, and I think Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has shown a willingness to sort of hold out and not necessarily play nice with the other chamber. But also, as he has noted, his chamber has repeatedly passed a lot of these top priority legislation, and it gets stalled out in the House. And so, is it perhaps in his best interest to try to play nice with the House Speaker when there is widespread agreement on a lot of this? I would say yes.
And looking ahead, State of the State address is on Sunday, as you previously mentioned. The governor is going to come out with his emergency items. Lieutenant Governor Patrick has said, we've got to get going. We've got to get moving on these things. And the House is known typically for rolling a little bit slower. And so it'll be curious to see once the Senate, because I have no doubt that the Senate will hit the ground running and get going on a bunch of these things, how quickly the House will move. And I think if the House doesn't move as quickly as the lieutenant governor wants it, then you might see some of this tension start to build up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably safe to assume that school vouchers will be an emergency item, which will allow the legislature to move more quickly. I believe as we are recording this, the Senate is having a hearing on the bill, and once that speech happens on Sunday, and it is declared an emergency item, the Senate, I would expect, will move, in early February to pass that bill. So we could be in a situation where, this aspect of the legislature is decided quite quickly. So, James, as already mentioned, on Sunday, you will be doing your favorite Sunday activity of covering a speech by the governor.
You call Matthew a nerd?
Yeah.
You were
Lord's Day, people. Come
you
on.
were jubilant.
What else do you expect from that? What are you watching for?
I'm curious to see what we do with border stuff. Obviously, Republicans have a partner now in the federal government, but there's still a lot of money dedicated in the budget for border security and immigration enforcement. So I wonder what will happen there. I'm also curious. There's always been this ongoing issue of bail reform, and I think election integrity. I don't have a whole lot of insight into the governor, but yeah, I'm curious about those issues because they've been things that he's been very supportive of in the past. But yeah, I'm kind of curious because there's been so much focus on vouchers that I wonder what else he's sort of been thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
And also, one more thing. We talk about this sort of line that the governor walks between, traditional Republicans who are more business friendly and think about things like infrastructure, which I know we're going to talk about next, and the social conservatives who want to fight a lot about LGBT rights and abortion and all these things, right? So I wonder what he will signal in sort of his attempt to walk that line.
Well, speaking of wanting to know what people are thinking, we would also like to know what our audience is thinking. We're interested in possibly answering some questions or discussing topics that people send in. So if you have any comments, questions, thoughts for the TribCast, things you'd like us to discuss, shoot us an email, tribcast@texastribune.org. If you happen to be the governor and you're listening,
Yes.
You are also welcome.
You are welcome in our
write
inboxes.
Invited to
Yeah,
the
in fact,
TribCast.
we would give you the welcome of the century.
Yeah. But you also don't have to be the governor.
Right.
So write in. All right. Well, we are going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Eleanor is going to hop off because she has another speaking engagement, but we're going to talk about water after that. See you later, Eleanor.
Thank you so much.
Water grows our food, economy, and future. Discover how Texas farmers make strides to make water last for Texans now and for generations to come. More at watergrows.org. Okay, Texas summers might seem hot and dry now, but it was even worse in the 1950s. Between 1949 and 1957, Texas received between 30% and 50% less rainfall as during normal years. The drought wiped out half of the state's farming industry. More than 1,000 cities and communities had to implement water use restrictions during that time. It's now referred to as the drought of record in Texas, and Texas uses that time as a benchmark to measure the sufficiency of its water infrastructure moving forward. Jeremy Mazer, who is our guest right now, Director of Natural Resources and Infrastructure Policy at the Texas 2036 think tank, recently assessed that readiness, and the results were not encouraging, at least from my eye. Jeremy is our guest. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Matthew, James, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be here this morning.
Right. So great to have you. Let's talk about this 1950s type drought situation, because you wrote a report on this and you led the report basically saying that we could potentially see some major damage if we see another drought like that in the future. Lay out for us that scenario, that sort of worst case scenario we could face.
So Texas 2036, we released a report assessing Texas water infrastructure needs. And those basically fall into two buckets. First, we need to expand our water supply portfolio for a drought-prone and growing state. We can talk more about this later, but droughts are part of the Texas experience. If you've been here for a year, 10 years, a century, you know we're a drought-prone state. The second bucket of challenges we face relates to the issues of aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. And thanks to the Texas Tribune, you guys have covered a lot of stories across the state, from East Texas to West Texas, even in the Valley, of aging, deteriorating systems that are failing, falling apart, and leaking, and really becoming liabilities to the communities that they serve. But starting with the drought issue and the need to expand our water supplies. So in the 1950s, we had this drought of record, and that was the worst recorded drought.
Basically worse since like 1895 or something like that, right?
Well,
when
yes,
we started recording.
We started recording in 1894, 1895, you're right. And there were droughts around World War I and the 1930s, such as with the Dust Bowl. But the 1950s drought was pretty unique in terms of its duration and its severity. And what was remarkable about that drought, it really prompted two things to start happening in Texas. First, it began our campaign of water planning and aggressively developing more water supplies, principally water wells and reservoirs. But the 1950s drought also began this huge economic and cultural shift in the Texas, where we started becoming less of a rural agrarian state, and a lot of people started moving towards the cities. And so I think cities is where the majority of people live today. That trend started during the drought of record of the 1950s.
Right. And so you, like you said, you identified kind of two different needs that the state has in order to meet this. One is sort of finding new water supply in the state. The other is fixing those broken water and wastewater systems. The total that you put together, I believe, in this report, or your team put together, is that in order to do those two things sufficiently to be prepared for a 1950s type drought, we would need to spend $154 billion over the next 50 years.
That's right, Matthew. What we did is we looked at the cost estimates in the state water plan, as well as those from the EPA, on how much needs to be spent over the next couple decades for fixing and rehabilitating our aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems. And when we adjusted those numbers, those cost estimates for inflation, we see that the state is going to need to spend at least $154 billion over the next half centuries on water infrastructure. But the good news is we have some existing programs that are already working to provide financial assistance, such as the Texas Water Fund, approved by voters in Proposition 6 last year, the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, that voters approved 11 years ago. But these existing funds are only going to be able to provide, according to our estimates, about $40 to $45 billion worth of long-term financial assistance.
Say that number again.
About $40 to $45 billion in the long run of financial assistance. And so we're seeing that there's going to be a big financial assistance funding gap to just north of $110 billion of what the state really needs to pony up to invest in order to fix our water infrastructure challenges.
How did we get so far behind here? Is it, I mean, Texas is obviously a place that's growing a lot. How much is this growth? How much of it is underinvestment in the past? What put us in this position in 2025?
And are we an outlier compared to other states?
Well, I think what's unique about Texas is, unlike other states such as Florida, New York, Illinois, they really don't have drought and water supply issues like we do. I think, our water supply challenges are certainly analogous to what's being seen in the desert Southwest with California, Arizona, and New Mexico, which is in the throes of actually a mega drought right now. But I think also the issues that we have with aging, deteriorating drinking water and wastewater systems, those are not just a Texas problem. I mean, those also exist in Florida, California, from coast to coast. But Matthew, you asked, why has it come to this? And I think there are several factors that have been accelerating and aggravating our water infrastructure challenges. First, when we look at the data, such as studies we've done in partnership with the Office of State Climatologist, we're seeing that droughts and extreme heat are accelerating the strains on our water supplies. The hotter it gets, the quicker your lakes and reservoirs dry up. The less rain that we have means that there's less water in those surface water resources, but also means that we're drawing a lot more from our groundwater. And so what's happening with the weather has been accelerating the strains on water supplies. There's also the issue of population and economic growth. If you talk with water policy people, they're going to say there's a lot of people coming to Texas and they're not bringing water with them. That's true. But there's also a unique expansion in water-intensive industries in Texas as part of the Texas economic miracle, where you have a growth in the energy sector, semiconductor manufacturers, data centers, just to name a few, that all have to use water resources in order to work. And the state's political economy is such as that's very attractive for these industries and businesses to move here, which is good, economic growth and jobs, but that's also accelerating the strains on our water resources. And then the last issues, Matthew, as you pointed to in your question, the state's financial assistance policy has been incremental over time. And so what we haven't really seen is a sustained, concerted, reliable effort to address these long-term funding needs for water infrastructure.
You touched a little bit on the economic impact of this, and I want to dig a little bit deeper in there. You talk about it a little bit in your report about how a lot of the big infrastructure or commercial investments, industrial investments in the state recently have been accompanied by communities where those investments have happened, really, taking big steps to increase their long-term water supply. Things like the Samsung plant north of Austin and things like that. One of the things you really talk about is that if this is felt, we've seen communities go through water crises. You truck in water from other places, you get water bottles and everything like that. But what you could really see is a reluctance for companies and organizations to invest in the state if that water is not done. You say if we see another 1950s drought, we could see losses, annual GDP losses of $160 billion, nearly 800,000 jobs lost, and what you describe as a potential exodus from the state if we don't address these needs. What does it actually look like for Texas if we don't meet the water demand needs going forward?
There's extraordinary downside risk if we fail to develop the water infrastructure that we need. A lot of that's described in the report that I wrote with Texas 2036. Also It's explored in more detail by a report by Gabe Collins with the Baker Institute at Rice University, who we also partnered with to explore the economic costs and benefits of water infrastructure investment. And so we know what would likely be the potential economic losses in terms of millions of jobs lost, a diaspora of people leaving the state looking for opportunity and potentially water elsewhere. And not to mention the 160 plus billion dollars per year in GDP losses, which for comparison is worse than the economic losses observed during the COVID pandemic and the Great Recession. But there are some fascinating examples that we point to in our report of what inadequate water infrastructure has meant for other economies. Australia saw some negative growth in its GDP during the millennial drought between the early 2000s and 2015. Same thing for Cape Town, South Africa. And there are some fascinating examples from the rest of the world of how not only you actually realize and see this economic downturn, but there's also cases of businesses and industries shutting down and not working anymore, absent drought. And reliable water supplies are increasingly becoming a part of the economic development equation in Texas. When I've been talking with state leaders, a lot of them are saying like, "Hey, we're talking with companies. They want to come to Texas. They like so many things here." The question we're getting asked is if we have enough reliable water.
Right. And we've seen this in some ways kind of already start to play out in regions of the state. Like, talk a little bit about what's happening in the Rio Grande Valley.
The Rio Grande Valley is comes in and out of trouble almost like every 2 years. I mean, 2022, August of that year, the water levels in Lake Amistad and Lake Falcone were at precipitous lows, and city managers were looking at emergency measures they may have to implement in order to avoid cutting people off of water. Fortunately, a tropical depression came over, put a bunch of water in the river, saved the day for a little while. But again, in 2024, low water conditions in the Rio Grande Valley have begun to precipitate some real economic consequences. Notably, when a year ago, the Santa Rosa Mill closed, and that was a business that provided over 500 jobs within the region and about 500 million plus in regional GDP. In addition to seeing that farm close, we're the sugar cane farm close. We're also hearing that the citrus industry is under duress due to drought conditions. And I think the Rio Grande Valley is becoming a bit of a canary in the coal mine for Texas in terms of describing what can happen and what will go wrong and what economic horrors will be visited on your region if you have insufficient water supplies.
All right, let's talk about the two quick kind of areas that need investment very quickly. One, as we already mentioned, water supplies, this actual water, that the state needs to draw from. You listed the water supply deficit as being nearly 6.9 million acre feet of water. For people to understand, 1 acre foot serves around 2 to 3 houses per year. So if you're 6.9 million acre feet short, you're talking about somewhere around like 17 million. The shortage being about enough to serve 17 million houses per year in that realm. Of course, it's more than just houses that draw from the water. It's industry and agriculture and everything like that. But what are the solutions there? I mean, obviously you need to invest money, but is that money to build reservoirs, like desalination? Like what actually needs to be built and done in this state in order to get to where we need to be for that supply?
So our 6.9 million projected 6.9 million acre foot water supply deficit comes from the most recent state water plan prepared by the Texas Water Development Board. What needs to happen is the state needs to invest in a broad, diversified water supply portfolio. And some of these projects are going to be the same types of water supply technologies they used in the Roman Empire, your groundwater wells and your reservoirs. But I think a lot of those types of easier water supply projects, relatively easier, are I mean, a lot of those have already been built. And so there's not a lot of easier water to develop. I think we're going to have to lean into technology, innovation, and water supply diversification in order to meet that 6.9 million acre foot water supply deficit. And so we're going to be talking about greater water conservation. I think water reuse and recycling is exciting. That can be done. That can expand the water supply portfolio. And we're also going to talk about, desalination of seawater and brackish water. But also we need to have a bigger conversation about moving water from the water-rich areas of the state to the areas that need it the most.
Yeah, and that's where I think some of the politics come into play. It's not just is there support to spending this kind of money, right? It's like whenever there's an idea to build a reservoir in the state, there's a lot of landowner resistance. Whenever a company, whether a city wants to pipe in water from, across the state, you hear a lot of concern about the local, uh, the people who are local there saying, why are they taking water away from our community? Right, exactly. How much of that is a hurdle, do you feel like, in addition to just the spending?
And also with desalination, I mean, how effective is desalination, and is there concern from lawmakers about the efficiency of desalination, like going forward? Like, if you invest billions of dollars in desalination,
Yeah.
how efficient will that actually be?
Well, Matthew, we'll start with you, and then James will talk about desal. And so, I've followed water policy in the legislature for the past 25 years. And what's interesting is like all of those water policy fights are regional and local. They don't really break down on partisan lines. And there are some regions that are fiercely protective of their water resources for good reason. That supports their regional identity, that supports their regional economy. And the prospect of moving water from one part of the state to another is easier said than done. The same thing with reservoirs. I mean, there have been some reservoirs on the books for decades that have still not been built, but are just politically challenging to develop, owing to concerns about water supply development or even condemning that land. James, you asked about desalination. What are legislators thinking about desalination? I would say that over the past 20 years, there has been a growing crescendo of interest in desalination within the House and Senate leaders and the legislature. Desalination has the benefit of being a little bit more drought proof. Unless a meteor hits it, there's always going to be water in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a good thing. But it's always been expensive to do and energy intensive. And so I think the load demands of desalination plants are something that need to be taken into consideration, especially as we have increasing load demands across our electric grid as our economy and population continues to grow. There is opportunity, there is promise in desalination. Will it be the panacea or silver bullet that solves every region's problems? That we're probably not at the scale and position to do that yet. But desalination is going to be playing more of a robust part in contributing to our water supply portfolio.
And then the other part of this, to actually maybe the more expensive part of this, is just the pipes that are in the ground across Texas are crumbling. They're starting to break down. Some of that is, in fact, worsened when drought comes and it causes the ground to shift. But I mean, you've identified $95 billion to fix broken water and wastewater systems. There's an astounding amount of water leaking out of pipes in Texas that's causing waste and causing us to need more supply. Tell us a little bit about that situation.
Yeah, so this is data from the Texas Living Waters Project, which found that our aging, deteriorating, leaking drinking water systems leak enough water, 572,000 acre feet to be exact, to fill a major state reservoir like Possum Kingdom up north or like Buchanan here in central Texas. So our inefficiencies alone are just shoving water supplies out the window. And so we're wasting a lot to begin with. But then we have these bigger issues of aging, deteriorating, and failing systems. And the Tribune's done a great job of providing coverage of incidents that have occurred over the past few years, such as the boil water notices and water contamination in Laredo, the 35-year-old trunk line that broke in Odessa, leaving the town without water for 48 hours, even the system failure in Zavala. Y'all's coverage of these water system failures has been impressive, and it provides very good anecdotal data with regard to this bigger problem of systems that are operating well past their useful life and are really becoming economic liabilities to these communities.
And the EPA has estimated that this cities need about $61.3 billion in financial assistance over the next 20 years. So about a little bit over $3 billion a year to help address some of these issues. The past 4 years, that average was around 275 million. So we're talking about the need being identified being about 10 times what is currently being spent per year in the state. So it all sort of comes down to, I think, no matter what, there's a lot of money that needs to be spent here. We talked a little bit earlier, $2.5 billion identified in the budget or the proposed budget from both chambers this year. Your report, in fact, called for $5 billion. That's also what Senator Charles Perry, who's been kind of taking a lot of the lead on this, particularly in the Senate on this issue, called for. Are you worried about the political will to actually get this done? I mean, it's just hard to commit money in a fiscally conservative state like this.
So yes, we recommended that there'd be a $5 billion initial endowment for the Texas Water Fund, and the consideration of approving a $1 billion per fiscal year revenue dedication to that fund for the decades to come. The $2.5 billion that the House and Senate have initially approved for water infrastructure is an extraordinary good signal. This is the highest appropriation we've ever seen the state make for water infrastructure, more than the $1 billion for Prop 6 last year and the $2 billion for the SWIFT. And so the legislature is already sending a bright, clear, strong signal that they want to prioritize water infrastructure investment. But that $2.5 billion, which hopefully can go higher to $5 billion, it's not going to come close to closing that $110 billion water infrastructure funding gap. And so that's why we think that dedicated funding, which we already use for state parks and we already use for state highways, that financial strategy is the kind of model that we need to use in order to tackle our water infrastructure challenges.
The idea here is that in recent years, with transportation, with state parks, things like that, the legislature has essentially made it so that's automatic, that a certain amount of revenue coming in goes to that, like you say, dedicated fund.
Yeah, and these were constitutional amendments that were approved by voters in 2014 and 2015 that would dedicate state sales and severance taxes to the state highway fund.
So what do you feel like is the biggest, what worries you the most about this? What's the biggest hurdle that's going to have to be crossed to going from to raise the confidence in our kind of long-term expectations for water in the state?
I think the House and Senate leadership have sent a great signal thus far. I mean, $2.5 billion for water infrastructure. It's a lot of money, great start. And, we should commend them for their leadership on this issue. Getting to yes on a revenue dedication is going to be the challenge. And at Texas 2036, we've been working with chambers of commerce, EDCs, the business and industry community, in helping make the case for the legislature on why water infrastructure investment is so important for economic growth and development. Most people in the legislature, I'll say everyone, really likes the benefits of the Texas economic miracle. Economic growth, population growth, jobs, good stuff is happening here. They want that to continue. And they know that in order for that to happen, you have to have three things. One, qualified workforce. Two, dependable electric grid. And three, reliable water infrastructure. But if we want to have that reliable water infrastructure, there's got to be dedicated funding for it. I think that's going to be, it's certainly an uphill fight, but it's not an insurmountable policy discussion for this session.
All right. Well, we will watch and see how it goes. Thank you, Jeremy, for coming and explaining this complicated but important issue to us. Thank you to our producers, Rob and Chris, and thank you to our sponsor, Water Grows. Once again, if people have comments, questions, things they want us to discuss, TribCast at texastribune.org. We will be back next week.